Hey there guys, alright, today we are back with more of the Great War, this time the Ottoman disaster, the Battle of Sarıkamış, week 23. Before we dive into the video, make sure you go check out the links below in the description box or in my pinned comment if I remember to leave a pinned comment. Love it if you join the Discord. Now, go ahead and just dive right in.
Over the past few months, we've seen battlefronts all over the world. We've seen triumphs and disasters, but this week, as the new year rolls in, we see something we haven't seen yet. The annihilation of an entire army.
Oh no. That doesn't
I'm
sound
Indy
good.
Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, we saw the fighting go quiet on much of the Western Front as the soldiers of both sides celebrated a spontaneous Christmas truce. The rest of the week, though, it was business as usual as the French army's newest offensive kicked into gear along a wide front. On the Eastern Front, it was mostly quiet. You might be thinking too quiet, and you might be right, as the German, Russian, and Austrian armies regrouped for the new year. And in the highlands of northeastern Turkey and the Caucasus, the Ottoman army was marching through the freezing snows to meet the Russian juggernaut. Here's how it all went. The French army's new offensive was called the Champagne Offensive, and it was now in its second week. It would continue well into the new year. As much of the rest of the war was, it was an exercise in futility. The Allies attacking points of tactical importance in concentrated bursts along a wide front and taking trenches and positions from the Germans, and then the Germans, days or even hours later, taking those same points back from the Allies. Back and forth, again and again. Thousands of men dying for temporary gains of only a few dozen meters. But French General Joseph Joffre really needed this offensive. See, Germany held a large chunk of the industrial heartland of France and were only less than 100 kilometers from Paris. To keep up morale, he simply had to attack and couldn't just adopt a defensive posture and then wait and see what the Germans would do. So the back and forth continued in frustration and futility as it would for weeks. So 1915 begins on the trenches of the Western Front with more of the same. But I'm going to move away from death for a minute and talk about some more general forces, like economics. Specifically, the British blockade of German exports.
Been a hot minute since we've talked about the blockade.
Now, in the past, with British wars against, say, Napoleon, what would happen is that the British Navy would completely cut off French trade with the rest of the world, right? The French would then have to create substitute industries, which were of inferior quality and took a lot of money. And it would screw up the French economy, while the British overseas trade monopoly generated tons of money with which the British would pay the Russians and the Austrians to do most of the land fighting against the French. That was 1814. Britain figured that the same would work in 1914 and 1915, that stopping German exports would stop Germany. But Britain could not have been more wrong. And when exports were stopped, there was nothing like the expected riots in Hamburg. Instead, the colossus of German industry adapted well to refitting for wartime production with no loss of quality. And actually, the German economy, with the blockade, would do better than all of the other warring nations in 1915.
No fucking way.
There was also a big side bonus for the Germans. The blockade was a great excuse for any issues with food and other supplies that may happen to become scarce. So the British were hated for scarcities that were not even of their making. And they didn't stop any imports anyhow, since these could go through neutral ports like the Netherlands, and international law prohibited blocking imports. But the blockade on exports continued. It certainly wasn't the only blockade anyhow. All of the seas all around Europe were blocked in one way or another by one party or another. Heck, look at Russian shipping, for example. The White Sea now frozen in the north, and the Black Sea a prison in the south, as they were hemmed in by the Ottoman Empire. And this week, actually...
Hold on. That threw me off a bit. I don't know why, but this looks fake. It looks like green screen, but it's not. But I don't know, there's just something about
Ottoman Empire.
the way, there's just something about how the ship in the background is moving that it's like throwing me off. I guess probably because, you know, never been on a ship. But it's so weird.
And this week, actually, things that had been building between the Russians and the Ottomans finally came to a head. Okay, last week at Christmas, we saw the Ottoman Imperial Army, nearly 150,000 strong, including soldiers and staff, well
Dead
armed,
body.
but
Okay.
poorly equipped, suffering terribly from exhaustion and hypothermia, marching through the high mountain passes of northeastern Turkey towards Sarıkamış to try to knock the Russians out of the Caucasus. This Turkish offensive was the brainchild of Enver Pasha, Turkish Minister of War, a modernist who brought the Ottoman Empire into the war pretty much single-handedly and sought to build a new Turkey with a new national identity. Pasha chose to undertake this specific offensive for several reasons. Its distance from the Eastern Front was important, of course. It would be hard for Russia to reinforce the Caucasus all the way from Poland. And the Russian Caucasus army had been stripped of a lot of men who'd been sent north in the first place. But there was another big thing here. Pasha really believed this would have an emotional importance not only to Turks, but other peoples as well. Russian rule in the Caucasus had been imposed often brutally for over 100 years on the various people living there.
Yeah.
Pasha thought that when he attacked, they would rally to his cause, but the problem was that by 1915, they were waking up to their own national identities. Within the past 40 years, a bunch of nations had actually been liberated from the Ottoman Empire: Serbia, Albania, Romania, and so forth. And the Arabs and Kurds saw this and had their own national agendas. And actually, Kurds in the Ottoman army sometimes even deserted and joined the Russians, having themselves been often brutally repressed by the Ottomans. So
yeah, you know, if you're brutally oppressing some people, maybe you shouldn't try and be the savior and, like, I mean, I don't know how to word this. How do you word this? Moving on.
Things weren't at all in reality as Pasha believed them to be. And the scene of the battles is a bad place to attack geographically in general, but Pasha compounded this. He attacked in winter, when temperatures can drop below -20 even at low altitudes, but during the campaign were far lower. There was only a single railway, and the roads were covered in snow, so his supply line was complete chaos, and most artillery couldn't get through. It also didn't help that Enver Pasha thought the Russians were retreating to Kars. They weren't. Still, the Turks persevered, and the actual clash with the Russians at Sarıkamış finally took place December 29th. Two army corps, over 10,000 strong, attacked, but failed to break into the city and lost about half their numbers. Over the next week, the Turks would keep pressing against Sarıkamış to no avail, even as the Russians brought in more troops and began their counterattack. Turkish units on their way to battle literally melted into nothing, as many soldiers froze to death. Reinforcements were unable to arrive, and one report has a division losing 40% of its troops in a snowstorm. Pasha himself got information that the Russians were attempting to surround the Turks, but he continued the attack anyway. By January 2nd, Pasha's field leaders said they were too weak to continue the assaults. Pasha insisted they do so anyhow, but the Russians now had the Turks in a semicircle and were closing the net. An entire Turkish corps surrendered, and by January 4th, the Turkish army was in retreat towards Erzurum, with the Russians now on their heels. The retreat and counterattack would continue for another 2 weeks, but I'm going to go ahead and throw some numbers at you right now.
Okay.
According to John Keegan,
I like numbers.
By mid-January, only 18,000 of the 95,000 Turks who actually fought the campaign survived, but it may have been even worse. Pasha's hands-on offensive had been a complete disaster, and his army was totally destroyed. But his failures were so obvious. I mean, how many thousands of men, more than half, weren't even killed by the enemy, but froze to death in the snows long before they'd even got to battle? Such a colossal waste. So that's where we stand as 1915
And did Pasha get fired? It sounded like he didn't get fired.
begins. Constant, never-ending attacks and counterattacks on the Western Front. The Russians moving into position to attack the passes in the Carpathian Mountains in the east. And an entire army destroyed, needlessly wasted, poorly supplied, marched to exhaustion, and finally freezing to death far from home in the snows of eastern Turkey and the Caucasus. Pasha never led in the field again after Sarıkamış, but he did retain his position. We've spoken before of Enver Pasha and his dreams for a modern Turkey, but we've never seen the staggering scale of his incompetence or his willingness to sacrifice huge numbers of his countrymen to achieve his nebulous goals. Actually, the deviousness with which he brought the Ottoman Empire into the war in the first place should have sent off warning signals that this man was capable of anything. But only now, as the new year begins, do we begin to see the results. It's not going to get better, and I'm going to end this episode with one more statistic. Thanks in large part to Enver Pasha, during the First World War, 1/4 of the entire population of Turkey would die. If you'd like to see more,
It was that high? They lost 25%. Oh fuck. I didn't think their numbers were that high. I thought that was like Serbian numbers and stuff, which I think it. Or did Serbia lose closer to like 30%? Can't remember. But that was the Ottoman disaster, Battle of Sarıkamış, the Great War, week 23. I hope you guys enjoyed. I certainly did. These videos are always top quality. It's amazing. Remember to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.